Hello, it has been 2 years since I last tried the art style challenge. I think it's about time I did another. Now the last 3 times I was too afraid of drawing humans to try human art styles, but I have become stronger, so in this video I'll be drawing both humans and kitty cats. Without further ado, let's begin with my own style. Usually when people do this challenge, they would redraw either a Sona or an OC, and I do have a cat Sona from my days in the Warrior Cats fandom, which some of the most recent people on this channel may recognize as my Skug Sona. As for a human though, I guess I'm just drawing myself. I do have multiple art styles of my own that I use situationally, but for drawing human full bodies I usually land on this style I'm currently doing here. I tend to add a lot of little scribbles everywhere when I'm doing line art and highlights. These are meant to stand in for details like clothing folds and individual hairs. I also add quite a bit of detail in the face. I don't do like anime noses or anything. I like adding lines and dark eye bags and all that good stuff that I don't see enough in art. Which can look off initially, so the last step of my process involves merging all the layers together and painting over the face to fix any details that particularly bother me. The face is usually the focal point of the drawing anyway, so this works out fine for me. My favorite part of the drawing process is the shading. I use the lasso fill tool to first lay down the general areas where I know I want shadows to fall, and then I paint over those until I have something I'm satisfied with. Especially when it comes to the body, I rarely take the time to try to make it perfect, but rather I just stop working on it when I feel like I've conveyed the shapes and mood to a sufficient degree. Currently, I really like making the shading very colorful and saturated and then adding some highlights in the opposite color. I also like adding a few stray strands of hair here and there, which is a habit I actually picked up during a past art style challenge. I always found drawing myself kind of difficult since I use pictures of myself as a reference a lot, and as a result I kind of treat myself as the default of how a human being should look like. That makes it hard to try to stylize myself, even if it is in my own style. I honestly cannot tell if my drawing ever looks like me. So here's some pictures so you can be the judge of that. Next up, I wanted to try the Rain World official art style. I already had a Skug Sona at hand, which I only modified a little bit to make it fit better for this art style. Skugs usually just have one color, so I left out those head stripes I sometimes have and replaced the white flower of the original design with the karma flower. I have tried replicating Rain World's art style a few times before, and there's a few attributes that I specifically wanted to carry over to my attempt. Most of the rendering has seemingly been done using these textured watercolor brushes. I don't really use those in my own art, so this is kind of already out of my comfort zone. The shapes in Rain World's art are sharply defined, but there appears to often be some lens blur, especially around the highlights, giving the art this sort of crisp but glowy appearance. But what interested me most was the colors. Initially, I thought that almost all the art has 2 main light sources, but looking at it closer, I think there might only be one light source that is then reflected by the environment, causing the light to bounce back onto the character from other directions. I never do this kind of thing, so I felt my brain expanding as I was trying to figure out how the shading works. It felt natural to give this drawing a background, even though I didn't do that with any of the subsequent art styles. I needed to paint an environment to have the light bounce off of. I also wanted to try replicating the contrast between the characters and the environments that Rain World art always pulls off particularly well. There's a lot of negative space. I'm a big fan of that, it's really pretty. Rain World's art style is not very internally consistent even in the base game, especially if you factor in all the promotional material, so there were some choices that I had to make, like whether I was going to give my Skug some legs, which I did, even though they don't have any legs in some of the official art. I was kind of doing a menu selection screen type drawing here. I do think that I might have made the Skug a bit too detailed and messy. Same for the grass in the foreground, and you can eventually see me slip back into doing scribble highlights, even though the Rain World art style doesn't really do that. But I'm still overall very happy with how this drawing turned out, and I definitely learned a whole lot about lighting and how it works in the process. Moving right along, let's do a human art style at this point. I wanted to try the Gravity Falls art style because it's a cartoon that I really like. I think some of my earliest human drawings I made on the internet may have been Gravity Falls drawings, and they very obviously took after the Gravity Falls art style as well. I don't particularly enjoy the Gravity Falls art style, but I thought for variety's sake it would be good to have at least one really TV animation, western cartoony human art style in here. Gravity Falls characters have these googly eyes with tiny pupils, which proved to be my first hurdle because it means that I had to draw a circle. The characters typically have these round chins, little to no detail in hair or feet, rubber hose-esque limbs, sleeves that just blend into the arms, strong shape language, and extremely exaggerated difference between characters, especially when it comes to the size difference between children and adults. Many of these features undoubtedly serve the purpose of making the characters faster to animate and easier to tell from one another. I also noticed that the art style is not perfectly internally consistent, which was great for me, because it meant that I get to have some leeway with my depiction of myself. Before I got into the coloring phase, the fact that my character had a hat was really bothering me. Combined with the round chin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was drawing aged up transgender Dipper. But once I got into the coloring, the resemblance got weaker and I was happy with the piece again. This art style is kind of stiff, the poses aren't ever very dynamic, but I still tried doing something with it that I could be happy with. I drew her kind of adjusting her hat, but I think realistically she would be like romancing one of the monsters. At the end of it all, I think I managed the style pretty well. My inner Gravity Falls kid is sleeping with joy. Up next, I wanted to try replicating the Cult of the Lamb art style, which is a game I played that's fun and has very pretty art. Now, Cult of the Lamb actually has at least 3 different art styles. There's the sprite art in the game, then there's the animation art style that's sometimes used in promotional material, which is a lot more basic than the game art, and then there's the still image promotional material. I didn't want to do the animation art style because it's missing a lot of the flair that I enjoy in the game art, but I also didn't want to do the game art style because that would have been too easy, so I attempted to lean towards the promotional material stuff. Now, the Cult of the Lamb characters have these really big eyes with this white slit in the center of the pupils. It might be a highlight, I don't really know. Usually they have no more than 3 colors and then an outfit, and they have these cartoony faces that defy 3D logic and no discernible gender. Overall, the art depicts cute characters that are still capable of sinisterness. Fits very well for a game where you are actively encouraged to murder cute anthropomorphic animals. For the shape of the face, I kind of used a mixture of the cat type follower and a fennec fox type follower, just for the long ears. I like those. I changed the flower to a camellia flower because technically I don't think a flower behind the ear is allowed, but I could at least make it match the flowers in the game. I noticed that the line art in the official art is a little bit textured, so I tried using a textured brush for line art, but it ended up being too textured, so I would spend a lot of the drawing time just trying to soften it, in turn making the drawing a bit blurry. A lot of the promotional art is so crisp and clean that it made me wonder if it could be vector art, but I'm not experienced enough with that type of thing to be able to tell. The cell shading consists of these simple round shapes, which is like the opposite of how I usually do my shading. I don't like doing cell shading, so it definitely proved a challenge for me, and I don't think I was completely able to match the energy. My tendency to draw kind of haphazardly until I landed something functional is showing. I'm kind of doing the artist equivalent of spaghetti code. I clearly struggle in situations where I would rather be required to make a decision about where to land a line. Regardless, I do think I managed to channel the cutesy, disturbing kind of energy of the Cult of the Lamb art style. Returning to the humans, we have the Scarlet Hollow art style. If you haven't heard of it, Scarlet Hollow is a visual novel game developed by the same devs who made Slay the Princess. It currently has 4 episodes out and I'm extremely normal about it. This style actually ended up being one of the easier ones to replicate, the cause of which is not necessarily anything to do with the art style itself, but rather the fact that this game has a very diverse set of characters. When trying to replicate an art style, I first compile and line up as many different characters as I can. This helps me figure out which details are features of the style itself and which ones are specific to a particular character, if that makes sense. Makes it much easier to try to design a character in this style, and this is also the reason I chose not to try replicating Slay the Princess' art style for this challenge, because that game has like 1 character. The main ways this art style differs from mine is that it generally has very desaturated colors. Even though I love my bright colors, I think the desaturation works perfectly for the story, considering that the titular town is depicted as kinda dusty and as having a dark past. Kind of similar as with my own style, this style also doesn't shy away from wrinkles, eye bags, and the sort. Although, as with most of the styles in this challenge, those details may not be visible if the character is far from the camera, and I'm doing a full body, so unfortunately, I don't get to have fun with all the skin details this time around. I made myself look kinda worried, because that's what I would look like if I wound up in a messed up, spooky little mining town. When trying to figure out the shading, I couldn't quite replicate the effect of the game art initially, and I wanted wondered about it for a while before realizing that the shading in this game... So the art of this game is traditionally lined and digitally colored, which I didn't do because I can't do traditional art. And I kept staring at the shading, hoping that it would reveal its secrets to me because I couldn't get it to look right when applying my usual multiply layers. And then I realized that the shading doesn't actually appear to have been applied using any layer modes. So for those who don't know, layer modes cause a layer to algorithmically interact with the layers below it. For example, a multiply layer has some interaction with the colors and can only make them darker, which is why it's often used for digital shading. But apparently the Scarlet Hollow flats just have a dark brown transparent layer above them. No layer modes, no nothing. I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong, but ditching layer modes completely is how I was able to get my shading closer to how it looks like in the game. I used to shade my art with no layer modes like way back in the day. Back then I stopped because it was kind of sucking the colors out of my art and I didn't like that, but for Scarlet Hollow's already desaturated art, it actually appears to work great. It was a struggle trying to hold myself back from doing scribbly clothing folds and also keeping the hands small enough, but I'm overall very happy with how this one turned out. The next style is not from any specific piece of media, but rather I just wanted to try drawing my kitty cat as a character in an old rubber hose animation type cartoon. I used various older cartoons as my references, trying to sort of find common traits between the different styles. One such common trait is characters having these big oblong eyes popping out of the head with those Pac-Man pupils. These characters usually have very big feet but wiry rubber hose type limbs, which are usually black. The designs typically consist of simple black and white shapes, not that much complexity going on because these designs are meant to be recognizable and appealing but still easy to animate. Another thing I noticed is that these characters aren't usually meant to be read as outright morally good or evil, but rather any character in these older cartoons is capable of cruelty or mischief even if they're the protagonist. And this also carries over the character designs. So I drew my cat flipping the bird. I also added some effects in this drawing, primarily just a static overlay, and I blurred the drawing in post too, since many of these older cartoons seem to have this blurred overlay on top of them. This art style was super fun to try to replicate, and I think I got pretty close. Then I drew an Among Us, so that I can have an Among Us in the thumbnail. I didn't actually have many notes on this, as the Among Us style doesn't allow for much creativity. I've already mimicked the style in the past when I was trying to trick people into thinking that there would be Rain World cosmetics added to Among Us. I was lying. It was very funny. Here's the final result. Last but not least, we have the Studio Ghibli art style. Now, if someone watching has seen my other art style challenges, you might remember that I've already done the Ghibli style twice before. I didn't remember that until already being done because it's been 3 years, but I think it's fine. I can improve upon these. Also, I can draw a human in addition to a cat this time around. Drawing the cat was actually super easy. My only difficulty was picking what kind of a Ghibli style I wanted to go for, as the way the cats are drawn is pretty different depending on the movie. This cat ended up looking sort of Pokemon-esque, but I still think it's a pretty clear improvement over the ones I made 3 years ago. Then as for the human, this one was a bit of a pain. Now, the Studio Ghibli movies have somewhat different art styles between them, but generally speaking, the characters are drawn with relatively few lines and they look pretty simplistic if still appealing. But there's a lot of underlying knowledge about anatomy, shapes, 3D, all that good stuff hiding behind these drawings, and a lot of that knowledge is stuff that I don't currently have. So I was really struggling to pretend to lay down lines like I know why they're supposed to go there. It probably doesn't help that I picked a pretty difficult pose too. Whenever they're not dealing with the horrors of war and environmental devastation, the Ghibli characters tend to be up to a lot of chill activities like cooking and art. So I wanted to draw myself sitting down while reading a book. Eventually I got frustrated because the eyes weren't looking right, the hair wasn't looking right, the hands weren't looking right, and I just couldn't figure out the leg position, so I stopped drawing for the day and came back later. At this point, I reworked the pose and redrew the face and the hair to try to stylize it in a more Ghibli-esque way. The eyes are actually way more far apart in this style than I'm used to drawing them, and I realized I should probably make the hair spiky as it's usually drawn in this type of style. Another detail I noticed while looking at examples of Ghibli character designs was that most of the characters have these black dot eyes, but occasionally there will be a blue-eyed character, and this is usually significant to the plot somehow, and a lot of attention is drawn to the blueness of the eyes. So I did that here, although my eyes aren't really as blue as with many other blue-eyed people I know. They're really more of an earthy color. but whatever. This was by far the most difficult art style of the bunch and took me maybe about 2 hours in total, while most of the others took an hour and a half or less. I don't think I was perfectly able to encapsulate the Ghibli art style, but I do also wholeheartedly think that this was the best I could do at the time. I think it's a nice drawing, but I also feel like it's still missing something, and maybe a year from now I'll know what that something is. Also, I hate cell shading, save me. And here are all the finished styles. I think, especially with the human styles, I learned a lot about my own art, about my own style, about where my weaknesses lie. I consistently had difficulties with conveying information with a limited amount of lines, so I don't know, maybe I could benefit from figure drawing with a time limit or something. My own style remains my favorite one to draw in, although the Scarlet Hollow and Rainworld ones were also super fun. I would love to do this again in the future, maybe with more humans, because I forgot to do the Hades art style. I wanted to do the Hades art style, it's a very pretty art style. I'd also recommend anyone else to try this challenge because it remains one of my favorite challenges to do, and you can honestly learn so much just from trying to do what others have done. It is a great and fun way to step out of your comfort zone artistically. That's all I have to say. Thanks for watching and bye.